Smile. I'll take it as a yes. That's lovely. Couple more housekeeping points. One is this is totally free. We're a charity. If you're delighted with what you hear, or even if you're not delighted with what you hear, do consider putting a £5 in the pot. But I mean, only if you feel like it, because we rely on that kind of thing. Secondly, comments in the chat, please, and questions in the chat. And then what we'll do is we'll trawl them out and we'll try and group them while people are speaking so that we don't run the same question lots and lots of times. I'm Roger. I am the Chair of Trustee of Curlew Action, and I'm only the Chair of Trustee because, as Mike will tell you, I failed to turn up on time to the first meeting, by which time they'd elected the chairman, which was me. It doesn't mean I know anything about Curlews, which in relation to Mary and Mike, I certainly don't. But I care for them and I love them deeply. I'm a writer and I'm a speaker and I'm a campaigner. And I was trying to think of some useful link I could do between myself and the distinguished speakers tonight, and I can't because they know their subject and I don't. And then I realised that I'd actually written 2 books on birds, one on a Manx shearwater and one on a grey partridge coming out next month. And the Manx shearwater I followed on one of the longest journeys of all, which goes right the way down to the bottom of Argentina and back again in its annual migration. And the grey partridge I followed approximately across 2 fields on the South Downs. So almost the shortest and the longest of migration routes. The thing about migration is, until recently, we knew very, very little about it. We didn't know why birds migrated. And it's only really in the last 50 years when we've been able to track things that we've been getting this information, which is why I'm so excited to listen to what the guys are going to say this evening. Very few people I speak to know that curlews migrate at all. And what we're going to try and do this evening is tease out why they migrate, where they migrate, how we know where they migrate, what the dangers they face when they're on these migrations. And some of them are very surprising, the migrations rather than the dangers. The dangers are all too predictable. And also about the landscapes that they leave and arrive in and how that affects their population. And all of this is in the context of a bird that is really struggling to maintain a population. To help us this evening, we've got 4 hugely qualified people, which I'm really relieved about. Let me introduce them briefly. Sam Franks is a senior research ecologist at the BTO, who's waving at you now, exploring how our changing environments influence bird populations. She's leading elements of the BTO breeding wader research, especially curlew, and she'll be talking on migratory movements of the UK curlew from ringing information. Helmut Kruckenberg, who is speaking to us from Bremen in Germany. Since 1994, Helmut's worked on the ecology of waders and water birds, and he's been involved in a long-term study of nesting geese in the Arctic. Now he's also tracking curlew on behalf of the German Ministry of the Environment. Dr. Rachel Taylor, also from the BTO, she's taken the lead in developing, supervising and reporting BTO research and contract work in Wales, and she's speaking to us tonight from Snowdonia. She has a long-term interest in understanding the link between Anthropocene landscape managements, that stuff that we've done, and structures on those avian communities, the particular interest in farming. And finally, Mike Smart, who will need no introduction to many of you. Mike is my dear colleague at Curlew Action, and quite simply one of the UK's top wader field workers. Normally, Mike would be talking to us something about valleys in Gloucestershire, but not tonight. Tonight, Mike's going much further afield and is going to take us to the marshes of Venice and the southern shores of the Mediterranean. So that's enough from me. What I'd like to do now, the way we're going to do this, we'll have all 4 talks. We'll then get some questions going, and we'll finish reasonably promptly at 8 o'clock. So, Sam, can I ask you to get the ball rolling?
Great, thanks very much, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here. I will just share my screen. You give me a thumbs up when you can see it. Oh, good. Everybody can see that, hopefully. Great. So I'm going to start off giving a very big overview picture of migratory connectivity patterns of both breeding and wintering curlew from the UK. You can see, if you look closely on the bird in the photograph on the title slide, it is wearing 3 of the different methods that we can use to understand migratory connectivity patterns about curlew, which I'll be touching on during this talk. So the UK breeding population, I'm sure many of you have seen these statistics before, numbers about 58,500 pairs, that's 117,000 individuals. And our wintering population is 125,000 individuals. So actually quite similar. And in terms of the percent of the overall biogeographic population, so that's all of the Arcata subspecies of curlews, that's 15 to 20% or so of the breeding population, and about the same in terms of the overall percentage of the whole European population. And those are statistics from Wetlands International. Now, we're approaching the season when the UK receives thousands of wintering waterbirds from abroad, from across Northern and Western Europe. And we provide, in the form of our estuaries, some internationally significant and protected land for these birds to forage and spend the winter. In terms of where curlews largely spend the winter, I've put just a few of the major estuaries on the map here, marked in orange, and we know that these estuaries host very abundant numbers of curlews from surveys like the BTO's Wetland Bird Survey, WEBS, and you can probably find an estuary near you on this map. However, it's not the only place where curlews spend the winter, and indeed quite a number might spend the winter on non-estuarine bits of the UK coastline, which aren't monitored on as regular a basis as through the Wetland Bird Survey, where counts are undertaken every month through the year and definitely during the core period from now until March and April. But the non-estuarine waterbird survey, which is conducted every 7 to 10 years or so, counts all those bits of the coastline which aren't covered by the Wetland Bird Surveys, those non-estuarine bits. And that tells us that there's huge numbers of curlews also wintering on these non-estuarine sections of coasts. But there's also populations that aren't necessarily captured by either of these two methods, and they're those funny birds that winter inland. And some of our estuarine populations winter both on the estuaries, but sometimes move inland at certain points during the year. And there are certain individuals which will be largely terrestrial over winter compared to their more estuarine compatriots. And we don't have a great understanding about this. And there are some very inland populations over winter, which you might not expect, like quite a lot of the valley bottoms in the Yorkshire Dales host quite large numbers of wintering curlew, in the hundreds or so. And we know very little about where these birds come from, how they move around during the winter. So what's really important to know is all of these estuaries are mostly protected as special protected areas under EU and now UK legislation. However, curlews in particular use quite a lot of terrestrial habitats during the winter, either partially or potentially almost exclusively. And these so-called functionally linked bits of land to special protected areas are not actually covered by any formal legislation. And so curlews, we could be missing out quite a large area of habitat, which is very important to curlews during the winter. So I thought I'd just highlight that. I'm not going to touch on it too much more in this talk, but important to know about our wintering curlews. So where are all these curlews going to and coming from? So we know from WEBS that we host, up to over 100,000 individuals, but where are they going to and where are they coming from? That's where information from marking comes in. So methods like metal ringing, which is kind of the original marking method, which gives information on the connection between where birds are originally marked and then where they might be found again later, usually by either recapture through other people ringing, or occasionally, and historically this was much more common, by being shot by hunters. But it's not only metal ringing. In the last few decades, color marking has shot up as a really popular method. So you'll see in these birds on these slides here, they're wearing both the metal ring on their left-hand leg for you in the photo, which is actually their right leg, but they're also wearing some orange rings and a white flag. And this allows these birds to be resighted in the field with binoculars, or more commonly a telescope. So these birds don't have to be held in the hand, either through recapture to read the unique identifier on the ring, or recovered as quarry during hunting. So they can be seen visually, which greatly increases the potential for understanding migratory connectivity patterns. And there's lots of different wader groups and keen reciters out there around the coast of the UK, which report colour marked individuals. Though some people who are joining this webinar who might be able to recognise some of the people that are in this photo, but you know, this is a huge amount of volunteer effort, largely volunteer effort, both the people who are out there doing the recitings, but who are also managing all of the data that come in, because the volume of data from colour marking can be quite huge indeed. So what does all this information from both metal ringing and colour marking tell us? Well, you can find that out for yourself on the BTO's online ringing and nest recording report. If you look at the summary of recoveries for curlew, and it's quite interesting because it gives you a breakdown regionally of all the different recoveries over time. So I'm just going to provide a really brief overview map of the foreign location of all curlews which have been encountered in Britain and Ireland. So either ringed in Britain and then recovered elsewhere, or they were ringed elsewhere and then encountered subsequently in Britain and Ireland, broken down by season. So you can see on this map that there's quite a good spread across Europe of birds that are subsequently encountered in Britain and Ireland, quite a few in Scandinavia, with a lot of dots in Finland, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, coastal France, and a few sprinkling down into Spain and Portugal. So those are dots on the map, but if we add some lines to those dots and then connect them to the corresponding encounter in Britain and Ireland, that kind of reveals a bit more information as well. So you can see that there's strong connectivity between the Finnish population coming over to particularly the east coast of the UK, and there's quite a lot of connectivity from the UK over to Ireland. So those are often largely our breeding birds, which go over to Ireland to spend the winter. And then we have also some connectivity from the UK population down into France and occasionally further south. So those are also, again, our breeding birds, which largely are either on passage here and then subsequently recovered, encountered in either France or further south, or our breeding birds, which spend the winter there. So once again, you can view a lot of these patterns yourself if you go to this fantastic tool, which the BTO was a big collaborator in, the Eurasian African Bird Migration Atlas. And here you can do lots of whizzy things with not just Eurasian curlew, but lots of other different species as well. Well, 300 different species from across Europe. And you can play with all the different visualizations showing you the connectivity between different populations. So if you break it down by different European areas, you can kind of see the patterns start to emerge about where these birds are breeding and then spending the winter. So the Finnish population largely comes to spend the winter in coastal sort of France and Netherlands and Belgium, and also obviously in the UK. The Dutch and Belgian populations spend the winter in France and a bit in Spain. And then we have populations from Central Europe, from Germany, and then further east into Poland, which spend the winter, a few over here in the UK, but also going into France and further south into Spain. So there's lots of other different visualizations which you can explore at home. migrationatlas.org is the website address. The one thing that I haven't covered, which has been emerging as quite a prevalent technology in the last 5 years or so, is, of course, tagging. There's all sorts of different types of tags out there, but curlews in particular have been a focus for tagging in Europe with GPS tags over the last 5 years or so. And there's a growing number of birds tagged in Europe, as well as a fantastic sort of scientific collaboration of curlew researchers across Europe as well. So these tags are attached in all different manners, which I won't go into, often worn like a little rucksack around either the legs or the wings. But if you superimpose the tracking information on top of that previous information from the Migration Atlas, which was from either rigging or color marking, you get a very different picture of the connectivity between different populations. So if you go back to the ringing map, you can see we don't have many recoveries from particularly east of sort of Poland and into the Baltic states and further east into Russia. But you can see from tracking, this adds a whole different layer of information, with information particularly from birds going to their Russian breeding grounds, largely from wintering areas in France and Germany, and a few from the UK. So tracking has this potential to add this whole new dimension to what we know about curlew migration, which has only just emerged over the last 5 to 10 years or so. So as I said, there's a huge and emergent collaboration of GPS tagging curlews across Europe, and Helmut, who is going to be the next speaker, will probably recognize some of his tracks on this map. So at the moment, there's somewhere on the order of between 150 and 200 curlews GPS tagged across Europe, which is providing really useful information, both on the connectivity between different populations, the potential interaction of these different populations with wind farms, for example, on their migration, and so on. And Helmut will talk, I think, a little bit about some of the things that tags are revealing about the fates of birds that they might encounter on migration. So that's pretty much it for me. I think particularly for me, tagging holds this whole sort of new window of opportunity and discovery with regards to curlew migration, and being involved in tagging projects, both in my professional and my sort of personal life, with different populations, both of breeding and of wintering curlew. For example, of breeding curlew in the Yorkshire Dales, showing quite strong movements over to Ireland. The Norfolk Head Starting Project, which largely has a lot of stationary curlews around the Wash, but occasionally we get a few migrants going off on their first migration, exploring out into the Atlantic or down to Brittany. And then in my personal life, because I don't get enough fun studying curlews in my professional life, as a member of the Wash Wader Research Group, looking at mainly the movements of tagged curlews around the Wash in terms of the terrestrial habitat use, but also some really fantastic data on their migrations as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to the next speaker.
Sam, that is absolutely fascinating, and I guess the next thing is to ask Helmut whether he did recognise any of those tracks, and I will come back with I'll come back with questions for you later on. So Helmut, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I will share the screen as well. Let's wait. So here we are. No, it's okay. You can see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, I was asked to present you some information about our tracking project we carried out during the last 3 years in northwest Germany. And the project is coming to the end at the moment. Preliminary, we are looking for new money, but at the moment we are writing on the final reports. And so I can tell you, of course, a lot of things of this project now. In the beginning, you can see here a map of Germany, and with the gray squares, this indicates the breeding population density of curlews in the whole Germany. You can see here in the southwest, at the River Rhine, there's Martin Boschert working in Baden-Württemberg, I think this is, and Rhineland-Pfalz. It's a bit distinct from the population we studied, but it's well studied, this population, since 20 years. He is working there. And then 10 years ago, the Bavarian BirdLife partner, let's say, the Landesbund für Vogelschutz, started also curlew research and curlew protection in Bavaria. So this is the other one there, but nobody cared about this big gray field in the northwest, which is the most the biggest, of course, the biggest part of the population. You can see here that in Germany we have, according to our last and newest breeding atlas, we have 3,700 to 5,000 pairs. In 2008, I propose that's a bit less now. And in the northwestern population, we have 2,000 to 3,400 pairs. In Lower Saxony, in Northern Westphalia, it's around 300 to 600, and in Schleswig-Holstein, again, another 300 pairs. So, and nobody knew anything about this population before we started in 2020 with our tracking project. There was just one guy working on Curlews since 40 years. That's Manfred Kipp in the area of Münster. That's, do you have a mouse here? There's somewhere here. And he was ringing in this county board for 40 years, but he didn't go somewhere else in the population. In Germany, the population trend of the curlew is a bit, seems to be stable in the last 20 years. We don't know exactly because it's all volunteered work, and they concentrate, of course, in the Northwest, where unfortunately only some people are active, and whether most of the people live in Germany, there are no curlews. So that's a big mess. In the red data list of Lower Saxony, the breeding population number was lowered from 2,000 to 1,200 now last year. So there is a negative trend in the population, but in the data from our monitoring center, it wasn't as good visible. So that's why we put a question mark on this. And of course, this graph ends 2005. That's the most actual data from Germany. And nowadays we have 2023. So there's, of course, a lag in time here in the graph. Yeah, project started in 2020 because our ministry realized in autumn 2019 that France is trying to declare the end of the hunting moratorium and wanted to start curlew hunting in 2020 on the AIVA meeting. And so they really got in a hurry that we found out, or have to find out, where the birds are wintering, because this was completely unknown. Yeah, so it was possible, surprisingly, to start this project within 2 months, get the money and order the tags. And so we started in April 2020, and in April and in May 2020, we caught 45 adult birds on the nest and equipped them with this Onitella tags. It's a GPS tag with a solar panel and mobile internet for uploading the data. And this was quite successful because the data, the results I will show you later on were, yeah, amazing for the people in the ministry and also surprising for us. And so it was possible to continue the project with some other financial supporters in 2021 to 2023. And you can see here in the list what we tagged later on, 68 birds in 2021 adults, in 2022, 7 adults, and in this year, again, 4 adults. And then we have a head starting project running, not quite actively. It's more that these birds or that these eggs are rescued accidentally done by the administration or were brought by hunters during haymaking, and they just put them away and brought them to the zoo. And we tested now with tracking these juveniles, where they go and how do they learn to migrate. But this is another story. So, but it's just here in the table for the whole data. So we use the flap nets with self-catching feature. So we put out the net and the bird is sitting on the eggs, and by doing this, the net is clapping over the bird then. The birds are nesting regularly in grassland and pasture, but also in extensive grassland. And you can see on the last picture, sometimes just on the pure ground on a mice field. Here you can see how it works with a clap net. The net is put on the nest, and the bird is coming back now. You can see he is a bit looking around. What's that? Of course, it's changed around the nest a bit. But after some seconds, in this case, that can take also 10 minutes or half an hour, he is going back to the eggs and is caught. So then he is sitting still on the eggs normally, but of course, in the moment you approach, then he is starting to flapping and wants to escape there. Our birds left the breeding area in the end of May. The first started, but the majority of the birds you can see here in light blue, it's 2021, and in dark blue, it's 2020. Most of the birds are left the breeding area in June, in the mid of June up to the end of June. Successful breeders maybe later on, and the first successless breeders quite early. So there were some birds who didn't try a second clutch. They left the area immediately after losing the eggs. And here you can see what we found out by tracking. You can see the tracks of the birds you have seen before, and the red triangles show the wintering site. And you can see that we have approximately 40% of our birds wintering in UK and in Ireland. Then 1/3 of the birds is wintering in France, and some of them also wintering in Portugal or Spain, and a lot of birds still wintering in the Netherlands, in the Rhine Delta, or also in the Wadden Sea. So we didn't expect that. And we have 2 birds which didn't migrate at all. So they were breeding, these birds were breeding on Speaker Oak, and were wintering there 500 meters, 2 kilometers in the Wadden. It wasn't quite clear in the data when we looked to the individuals, but if you make a model of that, you can see that there is a connection between the latitude of the nesting site and the latitude of the wintering area, also in our small population. And we know from the Bavarian birds and the birds of Martin Borchardt in the south of Germany that they go again massively more to the south than our birds. So we didn't have any bird migrating to northern Africa, and only some birds going to Spain and Portugal, and the Bavarian birds go all to Spain and partly to Morocco. So there's yeah, it's a northern bird, and it stays in the north then more. But what we had is yeah, they have a high tradition to also to the wintering side. This is locally quite close. They have their high tide spot where they sit during the high tide, and they have also distinct areas where they go for feeding and ebb tide. But when the weather conditions are bad, like here in the snow, the birds also migrate to other places. And this is one of our case studies where you can see this, that the bird in the cold winter here in 2021 left the Rhine Delta and went to Normandy, and in the more warmer winter than the year 2020, it's stood there the whole time on its wintering place, and didn't leave to France at all. So they have the option to react on the weather, and but they calculate obviously energetic costs of migration and compromise to the weather then. Yeah, I was asked to tell something to the fate of the birds. We have a lot of losses had during the years, and the majority of losses are in the wintering coming by peregrine falcon. They are quite successful in hunting curlews. And then we had some losses last year, which were really, had a good story. And this is what I can present you here. 3 of our birds were shot in France in the very first days of August. The hunting season for waders is starting there on 1st of August. And within the first 10 days, I think 3 of our birds and also 1 additional bird from Belgium were shot there. And here you can see what's quite nice. Also in the text, you can see the whole story here. The bird was feeding here, and then it was shot and brought to the beach, and then walked alone to the parkside. And by the car, it was brought to the hunter's house. And what you can see here, then the way back, that's the way the tag did in the police car when the police was there and took the tag and controlled the fridger and all the things. So the France police was quite active, so we didn't expected it. Here in Germany, you don't have that in the way you can shoot here, or we had Bivik swans which were shot, and then the police was quite inactive. So I was really positive surprised from French police in this case. And I got today from Gitnees, I got this data here on the right. The Belgian people made a calculation what is the damage of this poaching on 1 bird. So the cost of hand raising a chick was, sorry, it's in euro, but it was 1,600 euro. And then there's an ecological damage of shooting a red data list bird category 1. And they calculated this ecological damage with 18,400 euro. That's quite a lot. So, that's all the people who were involved in the project, and a lot of people we have to thank for the money, of course. And I thank you for keeping an ear and an eye to my talk. And yes, if you have some questions. And a lot of these things are published so far. And if you want to have this publications, you can send me an email, and I will send you the PDF back done.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Helmut. And I think those 2 first presentations have really started to build up a picture of the continentalness of this bird. So, Rachel, can I ask you to come and do your bit from high North Wales?
You can. And I'm actually going to bring the spatial scale down a little bit, because my research focuses on how curlew use the complex landscapes that they find themselves in summer and winter, and trying to understand what their decision making is about where they spend the breeding season or the winter. And I think my slide presentation is going to be run by somebody else on my behalf. So, oh yes, perfect. Can everyone see the first slide, which is lots of pretty pictures of curlew? So we started doing this research in 2016, and it actually came out of concern about the ability of agri-environment schemes to deliver conservation results. They certainly deliver conservation activity, but the evidence from curlew was that after 40 years of trying to improve conditions for breeding curlew in Wales, obviously we're on the western margin of range of this species because west of us is largely water. Curlew were continuing to decline at about 5% per year in Wales. So something was disconnected, and we approached this starting in 2016 by using tags that could be superglued onto the birds, because we were quite concerned about having impacts on breeding birds from tagging them, and at the time tagging of curlew was relatively new. So if you look at the bottom left corner here, you can see that there's a little GPS tag that's been superglued to the bird's back in between the wings. And these are remote download tags. So once we had tagged them, we could get very high resolution data. The tags were locating the birds every 15 minutes, 24/7. But we didn't have to recapture them. We didn't have to see them. And at this point, up until this point, everything we understood about landscape use in curlew came from visual observation. If you couldn't see the bird or hear it, but primarily see it, it wasn't doing anything. It was outside our understanding. So what I'd like to do first is to take you through a series of pictures of landscapes that are overlaid with tag data, so that you can see, visually understand what a landscape looks like to a curlew and how that might be mediated by two things. One of them is landscape structure, and the other is the status of the bird. Helmut mentioned that curlew can sometimes, if they lose their first clutch, they can lay another one. They can make a second attempt. We've seen them make 3 attempts, but of course the majority of breeding curlew fail to rear any chicks. And although historically all the time most curlew breeding attempts have failed, because they're a low productivity, long-lived species, and we'd be hip deep in curlew if they didn't mostly fail, at the moment too many of them are failing. So if we can change slide. This is a whole season's worth of tag data from a male curlew in the lowlands, actually on Anglesey. So all of this land is only just barely above sea level. It's protected by drainage systems. And you can see here that he's using multiple fields. Fields in Wales are a relatively small. Average field size for the country is about 5 hectares. But he's actually using land belonging to 5 different landowners. And in this year, he reared chicks. So this is the pattern that we see from a male doing the chick guarding. And actually it includes incubation as well, but most of that data is very strongly overlaid on top of each other. And if we move to the next slide, we'll see a different individual tagged in the same place. Now, I've made a very unfortunate choice of colour here, so you're going to have to squint quite hard, because the tag data is actually in a peculiar sort of buffy orange colour. And it's partly, as you can see from the captions, because we were trying to find colours for quite a lot of individual birds. But this bird is using almost all of Anglesey. So it's an unsuccessful breeder. He started incubation, lost his first clutch and didn't try again, or his partner didn't try again. And in contrast to the last bird that was using little fields belonging to 6 farms, this bird is using half of the island. So the radius of his pattern of movements is around about 20 miles. If we have a look at the next one, this is 2 female curlew that were tagged in the same upland landscape. You can see that there's a certain amount of overlap between these 2 birds, but not actually very much. One of these successfully incubated and hatched a nest full of chicks, and withdrew from the breeding attempt, as we find they generally do when the chicks were about a week old. The other lost her first attempt quite late in incubation and didn't relay. And you can see here that there's actually very little difference in the spatial behavior of these 2 birds. And I think that's partly because female curlew don't take on very much chick guarding. So the majority of their responsibility is with incubation and keeping themselves alive in the breeding season. In the next slide, this is a bird that we caught early in the breeding season. All of our tagging work is done pre-settlement, so before the birds have actually settled into a breeding attempt at all. And that's a decision that we made because we wanted to understand how many birds that are present in the breeding season make no attempt to breed at all. So rather than catching on the nest, which is a subset of the population, we catch before they get to that stage. And this female really, really startled us. She actually disappeared for a week. And when she came back, her tag had archived a huge amount of data. And she spent 3 weeks wandering all over Wales. She explored about 500 square kilometres of the country, spreading herself around. And the majority of this was upland, Welsh uplands, so 200 to 600 metres altitude. And she wasn't staying anywhere for any particular length of time. She would stay in a small area for a day or maybe 2 days and move on. So she wandered incredibly large distances. But on the next slide, you can see that she came back to the landscape where we caught her. And although she made one breeding attempt, but it was unsuccessful very early, and of course she was quite late by that time. She settled very late into that attempt, and proceeded to wander around a smaller radius of the landscape. This area here is about 5 kilometres across, and spent most of the season wandering around there until she left with the first of the failed breeders a little bit later on. But she came back to the same landscape. If we have a look at the next slide, this is a bird that gave me a few grey hairs because he was breeding in a silage field at a slightly lower altitude and overnighting right up on top of the ridge. So that brown area you can see at the bottom of that of the landscape image, that's considerably higher. It's about 300 meters higher. And every night he was leaving his breeding area and going up and overnighting on peat hags and on mowed areas up in the moorland. But when his chicks were about 10 days old, the farmer in the field next door to the one that the nest had been in couldn't wait any longer and needed to mow his silage, and agreed to mow it very slowly and in strips, so that the machinery was going very, very slowly across the field. And this bird escorted 2 chicks across that field while it was being mowed, about 2 strips in front of the mowing machine. And they all survived mowing. They spent the next 3 or 4 days in the field next door, and then they went back across the mowed field into the one that the nest had been in. And we watched quite a lot of that using a telescope, muttering and hoping that they would continue to move in front of the mower. So if we move on to the next slide, this is one of the more typical stories for lowland breeding curlew. So this bird was nesting in a field that's really sort of rushy, boggy grassland rather than being a particularly productive field. And in this data, you can see that he's incubating. So the male actually was only doing about 20% of the incubation duty. And he was moving around a complex of fields in his mostly off-duty time and doing quite a lot of nest guarding the female while she did the majority of the incubation. So his movements are quite tightly clustered around the 3 or 4 fields, which is something like a 500-meter radius from his nest. And he hatched 4 eggs from that nest. So we had a data logger in the nest to check temperature, and he successfully hatched 4 eggs. And we could see the beginning of the chick movements as his center of operations began to gradually move around in the field as the chicks moved around. Unfortunately, if we look at the next slide, when the chicks were 6 days old, the field was mowed to top the rushes off it. And all 4 of his chicks were killed. And immediately you can see a real change in his spatial behavior. So he's disassociating from the field where the nest was. He did come back for the first couple of days. He was coming back and searching that field, but he was also traveling quite noticeable distances, 2 or 3 kilometers away, crossing the river and going and spending quite a lot of time in improved pastures elsewhere, feeding, and then he would come back to his breeding site. And at this phase, if his partner had made another breeding attempt, we would have seen him settle back down into another attempt at incubation. But from the data that we've been collecting, if curlew lose young chicks rather than eggs, and or sometimes if they lose eggs late in incubation, they're very much less likely to make a second attempt. And in the next slide, you can see him really strongly dissociating from his breeding attempt. So he's now travelling about 15 kilometres down the line of the river to the nearest estuary at Mathtraeth. And this bird actually winters on the estuary at Mathtraeth as well. So this is his entire migratory movement in a normal year. He just goes down to the estuary and he becomes primarily estuarine in the winter. So by the time we get to 10 days after chick loss, he's given up completely and he's heading towards his winter pattern of behaviour. So if we have a look at the next slide, when we collect data at this high resolution, so 15 minutes, 24/7, we can start really understanding how birds see the landscapes that we have built for them. Because we have to remember that curlew are open landscape specialists. Before they colonised agricultural lowlands in the 1950s or so, in the UK, they were a thinly distributed, low productivity upland breeding species. They weren't using agricultural landscapes at all. They were very productive in the agricultural lowlands. You can see in the breeding bird CBC BBS trend from 1950 to about 1970 that the curlew population had been increasing at about 6% per year. That's the highest rate of increase that we can see in breeding data for curlew. It's probably the upper limit of what the species is capable of doing in a modern landscape. But if we have really high resolution data, what we can do is we can look at how birds choose to use different habitat types, because there's quite a lot available to them. You can see on the list down here, this is actually an analysis of winter data rather than breeding data, but we can apply the same analysis to either data set. And they're choosing from a huge range of different things. So forest is in there, obviously, estuarine and intertidal mudflats, cultivated land, beaches, which
I think, oops. I think you may have muted yourself, Rachel.
Yeah. I was very
sorry.
confused.
Can I have my slide back? It's because I had my finger hovering over the button, sorry. So we can start to ask the curlew what's important to them. And these data are telling us that salt marsh is important, not really a surprise. Pastures seem to be a little bit less important, but actually there's so much pasture available in our wintering landscapes that the curlew are incredibly selective even within that. So they use good bits of pastures and they ignore the bad bits. They're also quite keen on, in this case, mineral extraction sites. So these birds were tagged in Ireland and they had a huge gravel quarry available to them, which was a really key roost site. And the gravel quarry owners weren't actually aware that it was such an important site for curlew because they were there in the darkness. And obviously estuaries and intertidal flats are quite important. If we have a look at the next slide, we can build a picture of what a curlew is doing at different times of day or under different environmental conditions. And in this case, what we've done is we've taken all the news data and all the WEBS data. So Sam was talking about these non-estuarine and estuarine data sets. And we've projected our virtual curlew data from the habitat analysis to the entire distribution of wintering curlew all the way around the coastlines of Wales. And you can see here, no surprises, that when the tide is low, curlew are estuarine. The vast majority of the birds are below the high water mark, and they're feeding on the incredibly rich and productive intertidal habitats that the UK provides. And we have to remember that because we have huge tides in the UK, and also we have mild winters because of the Gulf Stream keeping our seas from getting frozen, this is an all-you-can-eat buffet. This is the richest source of available invertebrates for wintering birds, and it's the reason why we have so many wintering waders on our shores. But the really exciting stuff, if we have a look at the next slide, this is a very similar map, but what it's showing here is what curlew are doing at night. So we don't know, we've never been able to see curlew using habitats at night. Obviously it's dark. They're very, very quiet. They don't call very much when they fly inland. But look how much further inland they're going. So these birds are using farmland, they're feeding on farmland, and it's farmland that we had no idea was important to them. And one of the outputs of this research is actually to understand exactly that, to understand what curlew need from us in order that when they leave Wales and they head back to their breeding grounds, some of them will be breeding in Wales, like our friend from Anglesey, but other birds are going to be breeding as far afield as Germany, Finland. They need to go back in as good condition as possible. And in order to understand that, we need to see what they're doing when we can't eyeball them. And that's the end of my bit.
Again, absolutely fascinating. You can tell how fascinating this is because the attendees are going up rather than flat or down, which is fantastic. And I think those three together just create an extraordinary knowledge bank for us. So, Mike, the floor is yours for the last thing, and then we'll come together with some questions.
Thank you. Helen, can you put the slides up? Ladies and gentlemen, Roger asked me to say something first, very briefly about my day job, as it were. So first slide, please, Ellen, which is looking at the breeding birds and the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust project in the Severn and Avon Vales. And we are looking at birds mostly in breeding in floodplain meadows with late haycuts, where we think there are 34 pairs this year. That's the key thing. We've found 20-something nests. We were really quite successful this year finding nests, and the disappointing thing that those 34 pairs produced only 9 fledged chicks, so that it continues the story of rather poor production. This year we've put on a lot more leg rings and satellite tags. Next picture, please. Oh, there's one missing. Oh, sorry. Well, anyway, we put on more tags, and that shows very, very well that most of our birds go from the Severn and Avon Vale go down to the Bristol Channel. But now I wanted to go on to look at a much wider question. An awful lot of the fascinating research we've been hearing about is going on in Northwest Europe, and I've just used a couple of quite old maps. This one is from the Migration Atlas produced by BTO in the early 2000s, and that's showing where the birds that winter in UK are found in the breeding season, something which Sam and Helmut have also shown in some detail. So let's go on to the next one without talking a great deal about that. And similarly, this is the other direction where these birds showing the direction of migration of birds coming into Britain from the continent, and showing that strong northwest movement into northwest Europe, with the direction being northeast. Can we go to the next one? But I do want to go beyond this concentration on northwest Europe. This is a map from the Bible for many bird watchers, The Birds of Western Palearctic, which aims to give you a global vision of Eurasian curlew and its nesting range. And you see the huge, the vast area. The majority of nesting curlew range is going right across northern Europe, almost as far as China, and that we so that we are here in northwest Europe are really rather on the edge of things. The red is showing you the breeding area. The grey areas are showing the wintering area, and you'll see that they're going right as far as South Africa, as far as southern India, right down into Malaysia to Philippines. So they're going over a huge area. And if we want to look at curlew on a global scale, as Curlew Action does, then we have to take a much broader look. And this is a map from the 1980s, which aimed to bring together as much information on the birds of Western Palearctic long before much colour ringing or tagging was done at all. This is information based on field observations. Next one, please. And this is from the European, the Wader Atlas, which is of Eurasian waders, and this shows how the populations of curlew are split. It's thought that there are 3 subspecies. The western one, which is ours, is in that you can in this area here. I'm not sure, I hope that's showing, and they are coming. We've been looking right here, but many of the birds here are coming from central and western Russia down towards the Atlantic coast of France and into Iberia, and indeed down the Atlantic coast here too, with important, a really important site here, in Mauritania, the Banc d'Arguin, which a Dutch researcher happily called a warm wadensee. It's an area of huge upwelling off the coast, and is of massive importance for wintering waders, and a lot of curlews go down there, and indeed as far as the Senegal and the estuary of the River Senegal, and here in the inner delta of the Niger. So that's the first population group. The second one, the orientalis species, subspecies, nesting further to the east and coming much further down here. And here I'd like to point to a couple of sites in the Mediterranean. You will generally think of the Mediterranean as an area of where there's no tides, but there are in fact 2 quite important tidal areas. One here, the lagoons of Venice, where there's considerable tide, and even more important, down here on the Libyan-Tunisian border. I had the good fortune to live a long time in Tunisia, and this is absolutely fantastic area down here with a 2-meter tidal range. Wintering species like bar-tailed godwit, curlew sandpiper, knot, and huge numbers of curlew, grey plover, things like that, so which are using these tidal mudflats here, also wintering spoonbills and other things too. So there are these 2 areas in the Mediterranean which have considerable numbers of wintering curlews. Probably probably a mixture of birds from the Western breeding and some from the more central Russian breeding population. But then other ones from this population are coming down all along the Red Sea and then down the East African coast and in the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, if you prefer. So if we are going to look after curlews, we're going to have to look a very long way beyond Northwest Europe. And this has been the aim of a lot of international work for a long time. I, for a long time, was involved in the Ramsar Convention. And the recent horrid events in Libya have made me think of just how many species are using these wet areas which occur through the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and across to the Caspian. There's a phrase that referring to the Sarmatic Sea, which is geologically when the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and Caspian were all linked, and these there's a whole range of species which use these occasional, really dramatically wet periods which occur, and I'm sure that wintering curlews will use these areas when there is sudden dramatic rainfall in what is normally a drier area. The third subspecies, this recently discovered Sushkini one, which overlaps with where the breeding ground of the slender-billed curlew is. And you wonder just how those two used to live together. But you can see that this whole area is a huge area that curlews are potentially occurring in, and therefore needs a lot of international cooperation on it. Next picture, please. And so just to cover some of the international instruments that are available for curlew conservation, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance. It's called Ramsar Convention because it was developed in 1971 in the city of Ramsar on the Iranian Caspian. And practically all the countries of the world are now members of it, and they have to list at least one international wetland of international importance in their territory where the ecological character will be maintained, and most countries have listed very many more. There are literally thousands of sites listed on that list now. There's very importantly, there's the Iowa or Afro-Eurasian Waterbird Agreement under the Migratory Birds Convention, and that deals with the large area that we looked at on the last map, and Iowa has developed a single species action plan for Eurasian curlew, covering the whole of its Eurasian and African flyways, the flyways we were looking at before. And there is a plan close to fruition on an East Asian waterbird agreement, bringing together East Asian birds which migrate down through the China Sea to as far as Australia and New Zealand. And then much more familiar to us is the European Birds and Habitats Directives, which have huge potential because there is some much stronger power for enforcing them through the European Commission. It's something, the difficulty with the other ones is that all they can do is work on a sort of moral basis, on agreement between the countries. It's very difficult to force countries to do things they don't want to. But these international conservation measures have got to be considered in our work on conservation of curlews, not just in Britain, not just in Europe, but right across their range. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Mike, thanks so much, and thank you to all the speakers. I think that, okay, we're all easily fascinated with curlews, but I think that those 4 talks together create this incredible 3-dimensional vision of the bird that we see sitting on an estuary or sitting on a hillside actually is a dynamic force moving all over the place. And as Rachel said, is highly susceptible to what goes on the territories and the habitats that they're on. So I think let's go back to I won't go back to Sam because she's just left for a second. So I'll Helmut, can I begin with you? Just a question on, you talked about this eco damage figure, and there was quite a lot of chat about it. And I know you've explained it in the chat, but can you just run through quickly how that figure is arrived at and why it's arrived at? I think there's a lot of fascination in that.
Yeah, well, that is there was a discussion now in the chat. I hope you have read this. I don't know exactly how they calculated it. I got this from Gitneis, and there is a document, and you can read it, but so I cannot refer that now here on the stage. The background was that the police found the hunter, and this case was gone to court, and then of course there was a discussion about the damage we talk about, and maybe you have read that in the chat as well, that one of these hunters was now where is it? Fred had was depicted now, and he had to pay 350 euro for as a fee, and then additionally 2,500 euro for the damage to an NGO, and his license, his hunting license, was suspended just for 3 months. Well, depends on when does it start, if it's really a problem or not. But the question of this damage, how to calculate the damage, if you, let's say, for hunting, or if you go with your machines somewhere and destroy wetlands or forests or something like that, that in the perspective of EU law, that could be a biodiversity damage. And that what this BioVal project does is, I think, the first time where you got a tool to calculate this damage. Before, this is just a word, and nobody used it for protection.
And is there any sort of estimate on the annual amount of curlews illegally shot in Europe?
I don't have any idea. We have had 9 tagged curlews, juvenile curlews, and 3 of them were shot. So it's 1/3. But this is, of course, no number where you really can calculate it.
No, it is.
And we don't want. Sorry, and of course, now these 3 cases went to court, and I bet that we will see hunters carrying the tag back home in the coming years, for sure, because of course they are learning.
Yeah, it's a real problem, right? Helmut, thank you. Sam, just going back to your presentation and your inland populations, wintering populations, and probably everyone else knows this, but I don't. What do they do in the summer?
Well, that's a very good question, Roger. I think some of them have been colour marked, and so particularly in Wensleydale, we know that a few of them are local breeders. We know that one goes to molt in Ireland, but then returns to Wensleydale for the winter. Where the others go, no one has seen them yet, so the jury's out. Wouldn't I love to tag them to try and find out?
Well, okay, so when we do this, when we rerun this one next year, can you have done that? And I think that's absolutely fascinating.
If anyone wants to give us money to do that, that'd be great.
Well, there you go. Money to BTO, needed badly. Once you've done Curlew action, obviously. Rachel, looking at silage. I think we chatted earlier this afternoon. I explained we have talked about silage a lot, and silage came up 2 or 3 times in your presentation. Andrea Rayner put, and you may well have answered this one. Can landowners not be persuaded to stay their hand with the mowing if you know the location of a nest? I think we've talked about this many times, but really worth hearing your take on it now, if you'd like to.
Yeah, this is a really thorny one. So I think the first thing to consider, at least from the Welsh perspective, is that land use, particularly cropped grasses, so silage arrived with a crash in Wales in the mid-1980s, and it went from very little to pretty much the universal forage storage method for Wales very, very quickly over the space of 5 years. And that was partly because there was a series of 3 horrible wet summers and the hay crop failed, and partly because at the time the Massey Ferguson tractor and front loader was available, and the world, or the UK, had just switched from clamp silage, which was out of the reach of most small to medium farms, to bale wrapping, which produced a much more reliable crop and was something that small farms could do. So silage took over from hay over the space of 3 years, and has subsequently pretty much removed all of the Welsh lowland breeding curlew. We have very few left. So silage tends to exclude birds. This is one of the reasons why I've spent a lot of time working on breeding birds in the Welsh uplands, because that's where they're left, broadly speaking. But the question of whether farmers can hold off on cutting silage is really difficult, because the quality of a silage crop, we have to remember that the silage crop is what feeds cattle through the winter, so it's enormously economically valuable. It's critical to the farm that the silage crop is a good one, and that means that it's harvested at the time when it has a sensible balance of roughage to sugar. And the sugar content and the nutritional quality of silage declines really fast if you don't cut it when it's ready. The roughage content goes up, the sugar content goes down, the reliability of the crop as a stored fodder goes down. And on top of that, most farmers don't actually have their own cutting equipment. They're dependent on contractors coming and cutting it for them. And the contractors can cut very fast and very efficiently, but are themselves very tightly scheduled. So they can't hang around for 10 days or 2 weeks to wait for curlew chicks to become mobile enough to get out of the way. We were very lucky with that one. It was a very engaged farmer, and he was prepared to borrow a mowing machine and cut his own silage. But most farmers simply can't do that. Under the Wildlife and Countryside Act and the translated legislation in Wales, the Environment Act, in theory, a farmer that knew that a curlew was breeding in his field should not be able to damage that nest by harvesting. But as anyone who's worked with curlew knows, they're extremely good at not telling you where the nest is. They will tell you that it's in the field next door, and they will sing and dance over a field 2 fields away and be invisible in the field that they're actually breeding in, for very good reasons. You know, this is a species that's vulnerable to predation. They nest on the ground, they're big and tasty. So they have every reason to not tell you facts. So it takes quite a high level of skill to be certain where a nest is. And on top of that, you know, farmers don't have the time to do that. So I'm not aware that there has been a case where a farmer has been prosecuted, certainly not successfully, for harvesting a field where curlew happen to be nesting. It's also a really, really good way to disengage farmers. And frankly, farmers are so much a part of the solution to curlew conservation that disengaging them by threatening them with prosecution would probably set us back much further. It's a really tough one.
Okay, Rachel, thanks. A very, very full answer. Mike, I know you've got lots of form in this area. Do you want to come up and just talk a little bit about your negotiations locally?
Yes, well, very much agree with what Rachel's just said. Much of our project is making friends with farmers and talking to them, and we've wondered about, would it be possible to be able to bring some sort of court case if you knew where the thing was, but that would put the whole farming community on your back and be completely useless. When in fact, we luckily in our area in the Severn and Avon Vales are not dealing so much with silage as with old-fashioned haymaking. We're in very low-lying wet meadows which are not suitable for silage cutting. So you grow a hay crop over April, May, and cut it from June and July. And most of the farmers are small farmers who have a tradition of curlews nesting on their fields, and they really love them. Most of them will tell you, I've got a little book that where I write down things about my cattle, but I always put for date of the first curlew returning, and they really want to look after them. So you can do so much more by talking to them and saying, look, there is a curlew nesting in that field over there. Could you leave a bit uncut, or could you perhaps not cut that one? I think that in the long run, it will need government financial support to actually pay farmers not to cut their fields. I can't see any other solution than that. And from what one hears, that's not going very far on the political agenda right now. But some kind of funding for farmers so that they leave bits uncut or delay hay cutting. But as Rachel says, a lot of the hay is cut by contractors, and the contractors are they're running a business. They can't sit around. And I took a picture the other day of a 1970s tractor that one farmer had lovingly maintained, and it doesn't have a cab. He would see the curlew going up in front of him. Nowadays, you're in these huge machines which go at 30 miles an hour across the field. There's no chance of the tractor driver seeing the thing. He's going to flatten it before he knows. So the only way is working closely with the farmers and trying to get some sort of government subsidy to support them in the rather small number of fields that they survive in. It's not every field in the whole of lowland England, for heaven's sake. It's a relatively small number of fields where you'd be paying out peanuts in order to maintain curlews.
I think that they're two very eloquent and well argued points. Sam, do you want to add on to that one? Anything, or has it been said?
Only to concur that, I think curlew conservation in the wider countryside absolutely depends on the goodwill and cooperation of farmers, because otherwise we just won't have curlews in the wider countryside. And then I think, that requires getting them on side with the methods and interventions that will help protect curlews. And there's many who are absolutely willing to do this, as Mike has alluded to. Even sort of farmers who have switched over to silage, some who are very, very keen to do the right thing. Yeah, that's it.
Mike, you're holding your hand up. There's something else coming. Mike?
Yes, I wonder whether you might like to pose this question to Helmut, because we had the opportunity to visit some of his fields earlier this year, and I have a suspicion that that he is pretty pessimistic about the opportunities of working with farmers. So it might be quite interesting to hear what his view is.
Yeah, right. You took the words out of my mouth. Helmut, you've disappeared off my screen, but here you are. Could you just add to that discussion of that Mike's just mentioned?
Well, I think the circumstances in our area and also in the Netherlands are really different from UK. So you have farmers with relatively small areas of, let's say, 100 hectare or 150 hectare intensively used grassland for cows. You have, so I learned today on the AIVA meeting, there was a huge area with only of more than, I don't know what it was, 4,000 hectare or something like that, with a number of farmers below 100. And so we have, would say, on 200 square kilometers, we have 400 farmers or more. So you have a lot of more farmers where you have to ask for. You have a lot of people who don't want to do anything with nature conservation because it's all green ideology, and some of the farmers are really strange, in especially our area. So it's hard to work with them, and they had made, from their point of view, a lot of bad experience with administrational nature conservation from the ministry and from the county boards. And so it's not easy to handle them by volunteer societies, for instance, to go with them. And yeah, and they learned over 60 years in the European Union to do nothing without money.
And actually, Patty's just put up on the chat, would it be possible to identify location of the nests using drone technology with a thermal camera, mark nest sites with a marker pole so that the farmer can avoid nests? I think that's happening a bit, isn't it? Does someone want to pick up on that? Mike? Unmute.
Yes, we have tried that. And I know that Helmut and in the Netherlands, they've used drones. We've not been terribly successful at finding nests with drones. The trouble is they pick up, we have found that they pick up so many hot things, stones and bits of wood and bits of metal and bits of plants sticking up. We're not wildly optimistic about that, though I know that Helmut and people in the Netherlands have used that, have used drones successfully to find nests, but it needs a whole lot of backup people helping you. You've got to go and look at every hot spot that you turn up, so it's not as straightforward as it sounds. And one thing I wanted to say, as an addition to what Helmut was saying, we're talking about the situation in the UK and in EU Europe. What we really don't know is what goes on in those that huge area of breeding grounds in Russia, Ukraine, and further east. One of the arguments used by French hunters to say that they should be allowed to continue hunting is that we don't know what the eastern populations are not declining as the Northwest European ones are. I think we just don't know, but that's their argument. And Curlew Action was trying to engage with Russian and Ukrainian and Belarus curlew specialists. We don't know anything about what's going on in the breeding areas there. That it's something we desperately need to know. And in current political situations, I've no idea how we're going to find it out.
No, and I'm afraid you're right. That looks less and less likely. Rachel, you've patiently had your hand up.
Yeah,
and
no
it's maybe the last intervention of the evening.
So I was going to add that obviously in upland landscapes you're dealing with some very complex vegetation types, so that makes drone technology even more difficult to use. But on top of that, you've got 28 days of incubation. You've got about a week for the bird to lay the nest in the first place. So it takes a day and a half to cook an egg. So you're looking at a week to complete a clutch. And for the first 2 weeks of life, curlew chicks are, when you disturb them, they're pretty much as mobile as an egg. They put their heads down and sit tight. They don't run until they're at sort of about half stage development. So they're quite a challenging species in a farmed vegetation type to do anything that isn't going to essentially create landscapes in deserts where they're very exposed. So if you don't cut a patch for a nest, the chicks will wander out of the patch into the cut landscape and be, you know, extremely visible. And they're mobile. Once they hatch, they move around quite slowly, but they do move around. So again, you need a patch that's quite a size to be a useful habitat for them. It's a really difficult species.
Right. Thanks so much. I'm gonna bring that to an end. We try to be punctilious about our 8 o'clock stopping, because then we think people will come back again and again and join us. I found that absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure others have as well. And I was going to talk about just a little bit about, you know, all those agglomerations of lines and what they mean sort of philosophically with this beleaguered bird moving around Europe. But I'm not. I'm going to finish by saying that we are so lucky to have people like Sam and Rachel and Helmut and Mike actually out there getting this information, but not just getting it, dealing with it, caring for them, and trying to make this thing work. And I think that my biggest takeaway from the evening is that, plus those fascinating maps of lines all over the place. So thank you, speakers, for you. And I know you're all really busy at the moment, so that's been a fantastic, really wonderful to listen to you. Thank you, all of you, for turning up. We will put a video out tomorrow so you can see the whole thing again. Keep the questions coming. We have Ellen will tell you at the end of this. We have another quite similarly themed webinar next month. Hope you're going to be there. But in the meantime, thank you all, and I'll hand back to Helen. Ellen.
Thanks, Roger. I don't think I have anything particularly brilliant to add on to that, other than just to echo thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to put the donation link in the chat again. As Roger mentioned at the start, obviously these webinars are free to attend, and if you do feel like you can donate, we'd be very, very grateful. The next webinar is on curlews on the coast, so we're going to be talking specifically about wintering curlews. So similar but slightly different, and that is, I believe, a month today, the 13th. I will confirm, and I'll put it in the email that I'll be sending around to everyone tomorrow. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night.